Welcome to Glisso English. Real life stories.
Have you ever played the gas tank gamble? It's 7 a.m. You're sitting in your car, staring at that glowing amber light on your dashboard. Your job is 15 miles away. Your bank account? It is sitting at exactly $0. Your payday direct deposit doesn't hit until midnight. That means you don't even have $5 to buy a single gallon of gas. You have two choices: skip work and risk getting fired, or risk coasting on fumes and breaking down on the side of a busy highway. In today's story, we're following Marcus as he takes the ultimate commuter risk. As we listen to his high-stakes drive, we're going to learn some incredibly useful English vocabulary, phrasal verbs like to scrape by, and idioms about handling financial stress under pressure. Will Marcus make it to work, or will his car conk out on the freeway? Let's find out.
The alarm clock didn't just wake Marcus up, it jolted him into a reality he'd been dreading all week. It was Thursday, July 12th, the absolute hardest day of the bi-weekly pay cycle. His eyes flicked instantly to his phone screen. No notifications from his bank. Of course not. His payday direct deposit wouldn't hit his account until midnight. He opened his banking app anyway, a useless habit born of pure anxiety. Available balance, 42 cents. 42 cents. Marcus let out a slow, heavy breath and rubbed his face. He couldn't even afford a cup of coffee to take the edge off the morning, let alone face the real crisis waiting for him in the driveway. 10 minutes later, he was sitting in the driver's seat of his sedan. The morning air was crisp, but his palms were already sweating. He gripped the key, took a deep breath, and turned the ignition. The engine cranked, coughed, and then hummed to life. But as the dashboard lit up, Marcus's heart sank. There it was. Pointing straight at him like a tiny, accusing finger was the glowing orange low-fuel indicator light. The needle on the fuel gauge wasn't just on E, it was resting entirely below the red line, pinned to the very bottom of the dial. "Come on," Marcus whispered, tapping the plastic cover over the dashboard as if he could scare the needle into moving upward. "Just give me 15 miles. That's all I need. 15 miles there, 15 miles back." He had to get to work. Missing a shift today meant losing hours on his next paycheck, a setback that would completely derail his ability to pay rent next week. He was trapped in a classic catch-22. He needed gas to get to work to make money, but he needed money to buy the gas. Marcus stared at that glowing amber eye staring back at him in the dim morning light. Driving to work today wasn't just a commute anymore. It was a high-stakes gamble, and the countdown to midnight had officially begun.
Marcus sat in the idling car for 2 full minutes, watching the exhaust pipe of his neighbor's truck blow white smoke into the cool air. Every second the engine ran while parked was a second of precious fuel wasted. He shut off the ignition, plunging the cabin back into silence. If he was going to attempt this drive, he needed a safety net, even a tiny one. He unbuckled his seatbelt and began to systematically scavenge the interior of the vehicle. First, he jammed his hand deep into the dark crevices of the center console, his fingers brushing against old receipts and crumpled napkins. He pulled out 2 quarters and a sticky nickel. Next, he turned his attention to the passenger seat floor mat, flipping it over to find 3 shiny dimes and a scattering of copper pennies. He checked the glove box, shifting his car registration and a tire pressure gauge until his fingers hit a heavy metal object. It was a stray $1 coin from a vending machine change slot months ago. Marcus felt a brief spark of triumph, like a gold miner striking a modest vein. He brought his total haul inside the house and dumped the collection onto the kitchen counter.
He sorted the coins into neat little silver and copper towers. $4 coins, 1 dime, 1 nickel, and 2 pennies. Total $4.17. He stared at the small pile of metal with a mixture of gratitude and deep embarrassment. In today's economy, $4.17 didn't even buy a faux gallon of regular unleaded fuel. It was barely enough to move the needle a millimeter. And stopping and restarting the engine at a gas pump would burn a significant portion of whatever tiny amount he put in the tank. No, he couldn't stop yet. He needed to save this emergency cash for the absolute breaking point. He scooped the coins into his palm, listening to them jingle, and stuffed them deep into his front pocket. It wasn't a real solution, but it was the only shield he had against the long road ahead.
Marcus turned the key again, and the sedan roared back to life. He shifted into reverse, backed out of the driveway with extreme care, and rolled onto the main road. The real-time lesson in fuel conservation had officially begun. He didn't turn on the radio. He needed absolute silence to monitor the pitch of the engine. He left the climate control completely turned off, even though a bead of cold sweat was trickling down his neck. Running the air conditioning or the heater placed extra load on the engine, and load meant burning fuel. His eyes locked onto the digital fuel range indicator on his dashboard display. Instead of a number, the screen simply displayed 3 flashing dashes, dash, dash, dash. The car's computer had literally given up trying to calculate how much distance he had left. As he approached the first major hill on his route, a wave of anxiety hit him. Gravity was his enemy now. He accelerated gently before reaching the incline, trying to build momentum without forcing the transmission to downshift. If the engine RPMs spiked, he was losing precious drops of gasoline. He stayed in the right lane, ignoring the impatient drivers who tailgated his bumper and flashed their high beams. "Go around," Marcus muttered under his breath, keeping his foot perfectly steady on the gas pedal. "Just go around me." When he finally crested the top of the hill, he lifted his foot entirely off the accelerator. He let the vehicle coast down the long decline, letting gravity do 100% of the work while the engine idled. Ahead of him, a traffic light shifted from green to yellow. Marcus didn't press the brake immediately. Instead, he let the car coast smoothly toward the intersection. Every time he had to bring the car to a complete dead stop, it required massive amounts of energy to get the heavy metal machine moving again. Timing the lights perfectly so he never fully stopped was his only hope. But the light turned red anyway, forcing him to press the pedal and bring the sedan to a halt. He sat there at the front of the intersection, his foot on the brake, feeling the engine vibrate beneath his seat. With every pulse of the motor, he could visualize the microscopic drops of fuel spraying into the cylinders and disappearing forever. The commute is turning into a game of pure chess against physics, and the board was shrinking fast.
The traffic light finally flipped back to green, and Marcus gently tapped the accelerator to get the car rolling. He had managed to survive the first 5 miles, but the true bottleneck of his daily commute was just ahead. As he rounded a bend near the industrial park, his heart dropped into his stomach. A sea of red brake lights stretched out into the distance as far as he could see. Traffic was dead stopped on the multi-lane avenue. Marcus looked around in a panic, trying to identify the source of the gridlock. Far ahead, the flashing lights of an emergency vehicle cast a bright blue and red reflection against the morning fog. An accident had blocked 2 out of the 3 lanes. He was completely trapped in a stationary line of vehicles, unable to move forward and unable to turn around. "No, no, no," Marcus groaned, dropping his forehead against the steering wheel. Sitting in idle traffic was a death sentence for his gas tank. The engine was consuming fuel every single second, but his mileage was exactly 0 miles per gallon. He watched a digital clock on a nearby bank billboard tick from 7:22 a.m. to 7:28 a.m. 6 minutes of absolute waste. He faced a brutal psychological dilemma. Should he turn the engine off entirely to save fuel? If he turned it off, he would stop burning gas, but restarting the car required a heavy surge of battery power and a squirt of fuel to spark the engine back to life. If traffic moved forward by just 2 feet every 30 seconds, constantly turning the key would drain his battery and burn even more fuel. He decided to leave it running, his foot heavy on the brake pedal, his ears hyper-tuned to the vibrations of the car. Suddenly, a minor gap opened up in the lane to his right. He had a split-second window to pull out of the main bottleneck and take a narrow side street through an unfamiliar residential neighborhood. The side street was a complete gamble. It could be a shortcut, or it could lead to a maze of stop signs and speed bumps that would force him to brake and accelerate repeatedly. With his fuel gauge needle resting impossibly flat against the plastic pin below E, Marcus checked his mirror, turned the wheel, and took the exit. He was officially off the main path, navigating on pure instinct and prayer.
Marcus rolled into the employee parking lot at exactly 7:52 a.m. He steered the sedan into the furthest space away from the entrance, killed the engine, and slumped back into the fabric seat. He had made it. The car had survived the 15-mile gauntlet, though the needle was so low it looked practically broken. He took a deep breath, adjusted his collar, and checked his reflection in the rearview mirror to make sure the panic didn't show on his face. Walking through the front glass doors of the office, he immediately put on his professional mask. "Morning, Marcus," Sarah from marketing called out as they crossed paths near the cubicles. "Good morning, Sarah. Ready for a productive Thursday?" Marcus replied, forcing a bright, easy smile. Nobody here could know that his pocket held exactly $4.17, or that he was one bad break away from total logistical collapse. At 11:30 a.m., his phone buzzed on his desk with a group text message from the department team. "Heading to the taco truck down the street for lunch, Marcus? You coming?" His stomach let out an audible, angry growl right on cue. He had skipped breakfast to save time and because there was nothing in his fridge anyway. He typed out a response with careful precision. "Thanks for the invite, guys. Can't make it today. I'm slammed with this project report and need to power through lunch." It was a classic corporate excuse to shield himself from the invisible shame of financial distress. Later, in the break room, he filled a paper cup of free office water and grabbed a packet of complimentary saltine crackers from the counter. His coworker Dave walked in to brew a fresh pot of coffee and noticed the sparse snack. "Just crackers today, man? Dieting?" Dave asked casually, leaning against the counter. Marcus felt a sudden heat of cheeks in his cheeks but maintained his composure. "Yeah, just trying to eat light today. Felt a little sluggish this morning," lied Marcus smoothly, taking a slow sip of water. He hated lying, but explaining that he couldn't afford a $5 street taco because he was waiting for a midnight direct deposit felt infinitely worse. He survived the small talk, grabbed his water, and retreated back to the safe isolation of his computer screen. The morning gamble was won, but as the afternoon hours began to tick away, a new shadow loomed over his thoughts, the 15-mile return trip. By 3 p.m., the fluorescent lights of the office felt intensely bright, and Marcus's focus was wearing thin. Every time he tried to analyze the spreadsheets on his monitor, his mind drifted back to the employee parking lot outside. He couldn't stop thinking about the physics of the drive home and whether the residual fuel in his lines would even allow the car to start. To make matters worse, he noticed a subtle shift in the weather through the narrow office window. The clear morning sky had vanished, replaced by heavy slate-gray clouds rolling in from the west. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the horizon, followed a few seconds later by the low rumble of thunder.
Within 10 minutes, a torrential downpour was slamming against the glass panes of the building. Marcus stared at the rain in absolute disbelief. A wet road meant increased rolling resistance for his tires. It also meant he would have to run his windshield wipers and his headlights, drawing more electrical power from the alternator and placing a heavier load on the struggling engine. Just as he was calculating this new setback, his manager, tech lead Robert, walked up to his desk with a stack of folders. "Marcus, I know it's almost the end of the shift, but the server logs from the afternoon deployment are completely skewed," Robert said, looking stressed. "I need you to stick around for an extra hour to audit these data packets before you head out." Marcus's chest tightened with an immediate surge of anxiety. An extra hour at his desk didn't just mean a longer day. It meant he would be driving home during the absolute peak of rush hour gridlock in a severe rainstorm. "Sure thing, Robert. I'll dive into it right away," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady despite the panic fluttering in his throat. He opened the files and forced his brain to work through the code, but his eyes kept darting to the digital clock in the corner of his screen. Every minute he delayed meant the temperature outside was dropping, the traffic was thickening, and his margin for error was shrinking to zero. By the time Robert finally cleared him to leave at 6:15 p.m., the office was mostly empty, and the storm outside had settled into a steady, cold drizzle. Marcus grabbed his jacket, took a deep breath to steady his nerves, and walked out into the damp evening air to face the second half of his gamble.
The sedan's engine started with a weak, hesitant crank that made Marcus hold his breath. It caught, stuttered for a fraction of a second, and then finally smoothed out into a quiet idle. Marcus pulled out of the office parking lot and immediately realized his worst fears about the evening rush hour were true. The rain had slicked the asphalt, creating a glossy reflection of red brake lights that stretched for miles ahead. He crept forward at an agonizingly slow 5 miles per hour, his foot constantly hovering over the brake pedal. Driving in stop-and-go traffic was the absolute worst-case scenario for a vehicle running on empty. About 7 miles into the journey, as he crossed a small overpass, the car gave a sudden, terrifying jerk. It felt like the transmission had slipped, but Marcus knew exactly what it actually was, a fuel starvation sputter. The fuel pump in the belly of the tank was sucking up the last remaining pockets of gasoline mixed with air. "Please not here," Marcus pleaded aloud, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He shifted his strategy instantly, pulling out of the middle lane and moving into the slow lane on the far right. If the engine completely died, he needed to be in a position to coast safely onto the shoulder without causing a major pileup. He began to visualize the remaining distance to his apartment complex: 5 miles, 3 major traffic lights, and 1 steep hill. He watched the digital dashboard display closely, but the 3 mocking dashes offered absolutely no information. The car was running purely on mechanical momentum and the absolute bare minimum of vaporized fuel. Another sudden sputter rocked the frame of the sedan, more violent than the first. The engine's RPM needle dropped dangerously low, flickering near 500 before bouncing back up. Marcus could feel the car losing power, its breath shortening like an athlete at the end of a grueling marathon. He could see the exit sign for his neighborhood just 2 miles away, but the car was fighting for every single yard. Marcus managed to take the exit ramp into his neighborhood, but the small victory was incredibly short-lived. Just as he reached the top of the ramp, the sedan's engine gave one final, violent shudder. The power steering instantly vanished, causing the wheel to feel heavy and stiff like solid lead in his hands. The dashboard display blinked frantically as the alternator stopped charging and the quiet hum of the motor died completely.
The car had officially run out of gas, a little less than a mile away from the safety of his apartment complex. Marcus used his remaining rolling momentum to steer the heavy, silent vehicle off the main lane and onto the gravel shoulder. The tires crunched to a definitive halt, and the hazards flickered with a rhythmic, lonely click-clack sound in the cabin. He sat there in the sudden silence, the cold drizzle tapping against his windshield, feeling a deep wave of defeat wash over him. He was stranded on the side of the road, cold, exhausted, and completely broke. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small handful of loose change he had scavenged that morning. $4.17 lay in his palm, a completely useless sum for a tow truck or an emergency roadside service call. He looked out the window and noticed a small, brightly lit independent gas station sitting just a quarter-mile down the service road. It was close enough to walk to, but he didn't have a gas can, and buying a plastic container would cost far more than the $4.17 he possessed. Marcus grabbed his jacket from the passenger seat, stepped out into the damp air, and walked around to the trunk of his car to check for options. Underneath the trunk liner, next to the spare tire, his hand brushed against a dusty red plastic object. It was an old, faded 2-gallon gas can that the previous owner of the car had left behind years ago. He unscrewed the cap and tilted it. It was completely bone dry, but it was structurally sound and functional. Marcus felt a sudden rush of adrenaline replace his exhaustion as he realized he finally had a viable tactical move. He locked the sedan, gripped the empty red plastic handle tightly in his right hand, and began marching down the dark shoulder toward the distant neon lights of the service station.
Marcus stepped into the bright, fluorescent warmth of the gas station convenience store, his jacket damp from the persistent drizzle. He walked up to the counter and carefully counted out his towers of coins onto the plastic laminate surface. The cashier, a young guy with a sympathetic expression, didn't even blink or smirk at the small mountain of change. $4.17 on pump 4, please, Marcus said, keeping his voice calm and polite. The cashier nodded, punched the exact amount into the register system, and gave Marcus a small, encouraging wave as he headed back outside. Marcus unscrewed the cap of his dusty red plastic container and squeezed the handle of the pump nozzle. The machine whirred to life, but the numbers spun for only about 10 seconds before clicking to a definitive halt at exactly 1.12 gallons. It was a tiny amount of liquid, barely coating the bottom of the 2-gallon plastic jug. Marcus walked the quarter-mile back to his stranded sedan, carefully poured the fuel into the tank opening, and climbed into the driver's seat. He turned the key, and after a tense 3-second crank, the engine roared back to life with a healthy, steady purr. He drove the remaining distance to his apartment complex, parked the car in his designated space, and finally shut off the ignition. It was 7:45 p.m. when he walked through his front door, completely spent from the emotional roller coaster of the day. He collapsed onto his living room couch, refusing to turn on the television or look at any distractions. The final phase of his long gamble had officially begun, waiting out the remaining 4 hours and 15 minutes until midnight. He kept his phone face up on the coffee table, watching the digital clock digits slowly tick upward. Every hour felt like an eternity as he mentally processed the intense stress and vulnerability of living paycheck to paycheck. By 11:45 p.m., he was pacing the floor of his kitchen, holding the phone tightly in his right hand. His stomach gave another sharp growl, reminding him that a full, proper meal was less than 15 minutes away from becoming a reality.
Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, his eyes locked under the glowing numbers of his phone. The digital clock read 11:59 p.m. He held his thumb directly over the screen, ready to trigger the mobile banking application.
The final 60 seconds of the day seemed to stretch out, the silence in his apartment deep and heavy. Then the numbers shifted smoothly. 12 a.m. Friday, July 13 had officially arrived. Marcus tapped the icon, entered his passcode, and watched the loading wheel spin in a circle. He held his breath for 2 agonizing seconds until the home interface updated. Available balance, $1,424.42. A massive wave of physical relief washed over him, causing his shoulders to drop 3 inches. The direct deposit from his bi-weekly payroll had finally landed. He didn't waste a single moment celebrating or resting. He grabbed his car keys from the kitchen counter, walked down the stairs, and stepped back into the cool night air. The neighborhood streets were completely empty and peaceful as he drove the short distance back to the commercial avenue. He pulled up to pump number 4 at the 24-hour service station, the exact same pump he had visited with his plastic jug hours earlier. This time, he swiped a shiny black plastic debit card through the reader instead of piling loose change on the counter. He inserted the nozzle into the sedan's fuel tank and pulled the metal trigger lock into place. He stood there under the bright canopy lights, listening to the powerful, rhythmic thumping of the underground pump. The gallons flicked past on the digital display screen. 3, 6, 9, 12. The automatic nozzle finally gave a loud, metallic click, signaling that the tank was completely full to the absolute brim. Marcus tightened the gas cap until it clicked 3 times, climbed back into the warm cabin, and started the engine. As the dashboard illuminated, the needle on his fuel gauge swept smoothly all the way to the far right, well past the F line. The flashing dashes on his range display vanished, replaced by a solid, reassuring number: 410 miles. He put the car in gear and drove toward a nearby 24-hour diner to finally get a hot meal, knowing he had won the gamble.
Marcus made it, and the gas tank gamble paid off. But let's be honest, that is a level of stress nobody wants to face on a regular basis. Today, we didn't just watch Marcus survive his commute, we also leveled up our English skills. We learned great terms like catch-22, scavenge, and what it truly means to be completely spent at the end of a long day. You can find all the vocabulary of the story down below in the description box. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to ride on absolute fumes while waiting for your next paycheck? Drop your story in the comments below using at least one of our new vocabulary words from today's lesson. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our real-life English stories. See you in the next story. Goodbye.